Hi guys, welcome back to the History Buff series on the Berlin Wall, where we chart the history of the wall that divided a city for 28 years. So in the last episode, I was joined by fellow Berlin tour guide Quincy, where we discussed the building of the wall on that fateful night in August 1961 and its various revisions and additions over its 28-year existence. So with the building of the Berlin Wall, friends and families were cut off from each other overnight, intensifying the yearning for reunification and freedom as individuals sought to escape political oppression, economic hardship, and the stifling constraints of life under a repressive regime in which you weren't allowed to leave. So, in this episode, we are going to discuss the escapes that took place at the wall, both successes and failures, and the tragic deaths at the wall. And for this, I am joined by another fellow Berlin tour guide, Tina, of Tina's Tours Berlin. Welcome, Tina.
Thank you, Adi. Happy to be here.
Yeah, very, very happy to have you. Do you want to just, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into touring here in Berlin?
Yeah, so I'm an Australian. I've been living in Berlin for 7 years this summer. I came to Berlin on a nerdy history vacation because I've always been really fascinated by modern history. It was one of my favorite subjects in high school. My mum and dad really brought modern history to life. They'd pull a book off the bookshelf and link it to the newspapers and the news that we watched as a family at 7 o'clock every night. And I became aware of how fascinating human story is, how silly humans are. You know, this whole expression, those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. I became aware of this history rhyming with itself kind of nature, and I just found it fascinating. I chose psychology rather than history at university, although I played with history, but I was worried that I wouldn't get any social jobs with lots of humans if I studied history, hence why I did psych. But I kept reading history books for fun. And
that's what I do as well. I'm not a trained historian. I just read a lot of history books.
Literally favorite thing to read history
Same.
books. I just
That's how I relax.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just had a week's vacation and I read a book called Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism.
Love it.
Recommend. Fascinating.
Love it.
Fascinating. Yeah. I had such an interest in modern history that when I'd saved the money for a Euro trip, I wanted to come to Berlin. I spent a whole 10 days here, which you would think is a lot of time for one city. I thought that would be enough for all the museums and the tours I wanted to do. I fell completely in love with the city. I decided to move here. When I did, I didn't speak German, so I didn't really have professional options in my field of psychology. And so I asked the question, okay, is there a job I could do in Berlin in English that would fulfill me, that I would really love? And that is how I became the world's most professionally fulfilled person as a Berlin tour guide.
Love that. No,
spectacularly lucky.
That is a lovely, lovely story. And, you're very good at your job and it's very clear that you have a passion for it. So, yes, I think you're a perfect fit for the history buff. And by the way, you'll probably hear me refer to Tina as Miss Ernestina because that's actually her real name and it's just the best name in the world. So, Miss Ernestina, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Adi.
So, I guess before we get started, we should maybe mention a couple of facts and figures and maybe clear up a few misunderstandings about the Berlin Wall, because as we've discussed in episodes beforehand, the way you have to remember Berlin and the Berlin Wall is that the Berlin Wall was a barrier that was built around West Berlin, because remember, West Berlin is this island of Western land in East Germany, about 170 kilometers inside East Germany. Okay. And obviously this series is about the Berlin Wall, so we'll be talking mostly about that. But there was actually another border, okay? And this was the 7,000 kilometer border between the Eastern and Western blocks that actually ripped through the heart of Europe, stretching from northern Finland all the way down to the Black Sea. And that was actually closed in 1952. So yeah, it's, I guess, important to make sure that people know about that it wasn't just Berlin. And people say often, why didn't people just go around the Berlin Wall? But actually, the reason that they couldn't is because, yeah, it was built around the whole city.
I love this expression that, the Iron Curtain, they say it descended across Europe, all over the continent. The borders between the socialist East and the capitalist West was sealed. And West Berlin was like the hole in the Iron Curtain.
Exactly.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, as in between 1952 and 1961.
Yeah,
exactly. The last hole, exactly. So obviously a lot of escape attempts happened at that inner German border that was part of the Iron Curtain. Now, I think as tour guides, I think the most widely accepted figure because when you talk about escapes at the Berlin Wall, you often talk about it as in general also at the inner German border. And I would say the most commonly repeated figure is that there were just over, I think, 100,000 escape attempts in total. And of those, only 5,000 were successful.
So as I understood, that's when we're talking just the Berlin Wall and just from the point where the first generation of wall was built. So we always say in Berlin, 5,000 successful escapes over the wall. I think one of the state organizations says 5,075. But then recently, checking all my facts, for this podcast, I found a government state website that said between the building of the wall, so 13th of August 1961, and the end of 1961, there were actually 50,000 escapes.
Oh, wow.
And so then I went hunting with lots of our nerd colleagues, as we do. And was like, hey, guys, what's this about? We all say 5,000 escapes over the wall. And a colleague explained that 5,000 count is really from when the first generation of wall was complete.
Okay.
But of course, they sealed the border overnight on the 13th of August, 1961. But things like the underground sewage systems, to seal off the full sewage system was actually a several-month process. So when we say this 5,000 successful escapes over the wall, I think we're talking just that loop that enclosed the island of West Berlin and from the point when the first generation of wall was actually built.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying. Because we as tour guides, we have a lot of different sort of sources and facts and figures that we have to remember. And I think obviously, they come from different sources, so they can often be quite sort of, differing really.
There are so many numbers out there with this kind of thing because it's so hard to know.
Because
right?
also what variables are you using as well?
Yeah. And East Germany suppressed, of course, stories of escapes. They very much suppressed stories of people who died trying to escape because it made the regime look very bad. And so the statistics themselves are really dubious, really, really questionable. There's actually a whole graveyard of unidentified bodies up in Denmark of people who washed up on the coastline. And it's suspected that a significant proportion of them would be escapers from socialist East Germany.
Wow. So people who tried to escape from the coast?
Yeah, they think so. Yeah,
wow.
But just a stack of unidentified bodies that over the years washed up on the Danish coastline. And the suspicion is many of them would-be escapers.
Wow.
And so that's partly why we have so many different numbers on this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The number of people that were killed trying to escape, was number about 600. Now, between 1961 and 1989, so the 28 years that the wall was up, at least 140 were killed or died at the Berlin Wall. So in connection with, obviously, the East German regime. So 101 people who tried to flee through the border fortifications were shot, died by accident or committed suicide doing so, and 30 people from the east and west who were not trying to flee, and one Soviet soldier who was shot or died by accident. Now, 8 on-duty GDR, so East German border soldiers, were killed by military deserters, comrades, a refugee, an escape helper, or a West Berlin policeman. And at least 251 travelers also died during or after passing through checkpoints at Berlin border crossings. And unknown numbers of people suffered and died from distress and despair that was caused to them by the Berlin Wall. So we can put numbers on these things, but actually at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is not something you can really measure, So the distress and the trauma that was caused by the Berlin Wall going up. So, well, I guess when you're talking about escapes, I think the most kind of famous escapes that people know about are the tunnel escapes, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Around 300 people successfully escaped through tunnels that we're aware of. Mm-hmm. About 70 tunnels were started, and only about 19 of them were successful, which I think really strongly demonstrates how hard it is to build an escape tunnel. Well,
and also especially in Berlin, because the thing is Berlin's soil, so the composition, so Berlin is built on a swamp. So basically that means that the composition of the soil is primarily sandy, which is pretty unstable and prone to collapse. It has a very high water table, so it's very waterlogged. So it requires quite difficult engineering, and you've got to remember that most of the people who are digging these tunnels were not professional tunnel diggers, okay? So yeah, I mean, I guess the most famous tunnel escape was that of Tunnel 57. Okay, and that was organized by
Wolfgang Fuchs.
Fuchs, yeah. So it was basically a tunnel that was built from east to west.
No, built west to east.
West to east,
But,
sorry. That's the thing. Also, most of these tunnels were actually dug from west to east because there obviously wasn't quite so much surveillance in the west. Because obviously in the east, you had a very repressive regime of surveillance. You know, materials that were used for digging tunnels were restricted.
Even if you lived in one of the wall-adjacent neighborhoods in East Berlin, if you weren't politically reliable, say you had someone in the family or your friend circle who's identified as a dissenter, often the state would actually move you.
Right.
You would be moved to a different neighborhood. And there was much heavier surveillance in the wall-adjacent neighborhoods. Your odds of pulling off the digging of a tunnel from the eastern side were so thin.
Yeah.
Even in the west, there was still Stasi, so East German secret police agents, unterwegs, out and about, doing lots of spying. And so when you read accounts from these tunnel builders, the things they had to do were incredible.
Yeah.
To make sure, for example, that they never emerged from the building where they were digging dirty.
Yes.
Right? They had to make sure that when they came out, they looked fresh as
Yes,
daisies.
exactly.
No one would ever suspect that they've just been digging a tunnel because
Yeah.
even in the west, there was surveillance. And of course, it's 100 times heavier in the wall-adjacent neighborhoods in the east, which is why most of these tunnels are dug west to east.
Yes, exactly. So, built from Bernauer Straße in the west to Strelitzer Straße 55 in the east. So, 120 people were planning on escaping, and someone called Reinhard Führer guided them to the tunnel entrance in the courtyard. Now, unfortunately, among the escapees was a Stasi collaborator, a Stasi informant, who obviously said that they wanted to escape. And he actually turned up with reinforcements from the Stasi, from the police, and there was a shootout. And one of the border guards was actually killed, someone called Egon Scholz. And so the East German government decided to really make a martyr out of Scholz and give him a big sort of state funeral and say, he did his, job trying to protect the sacred borders of the GDR and all of that kind of stuff. Because that's what it was. It was really a big law saying we have sacred borders that you're not allowed to violate.
We see also how East Germany really used the story of Egon Schultz's death. He was only 21 years old, I think, when he was killed. They used it to paint escape helpers, so West Germans who would get East Germans out as terrorists.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and so really kind of made him a martyr. Now, it was actually only then revealed after reunification that he had actually, in fact, been shot by friendly fire. So by the fire from a fellow East German border guard or policeman. So if you go to the Berlin Wall Memorial, you can actually see exactly where Tunnel 57 was built. And the reason it's called Tunnel 57 is because 57 people did actually manage to escape successfully over to the west.
The single most successful individual tunnel.
Yeah, exactly.
So of all the 19 tunnels that actually successfully got people out, the most went through Tunnel 57.
Yes.
And I think, again, it shows how tight the Stasi's infiltration was in East Germany, that tunnel took about 35 people 6 months to dig. I think most of the diggers were students from the Freie Universität, the Free University of West Berlin Uni. So 35 people dig for 6 months, and it is shut down after 2 nights.
Exactly.
Yeah, and gets 57 out of a desired 120 people out.
Which is still not a great payoff, if you ask me. But still, I guess 57 people would say differently. But yeah, anyway, it shows you, yes, exactly, just how tight the regime of surveillance was.
I think one of the other most famous escapes, I think there have been 3 films made on this that I know of. One's actually pretty new. It's currently on Netflix. It was released in 2018.
Oh, yeah, I saw the advert for that. Yeah.
Balloon, yeah. And the original film on this was actually Disney. I think
really?
in 1982 there was a Disney film on this escape.
Okay, right.
Which I haven't seen.
I
have to
either.
see.
Yeah.
So it was 2 families, 8 people. So 2 couples and 4 children. Aged between 2 and 15, who escaped out of East Germany in a homemade hot air balloon. Quite incredible. There were 2 unsuccessful attempts before they made it, round 3. On the first attempt, the material they'd tried to use wasn't going to do the job.
Yeah.
Second attempt, the gondola, the basket they constructed was too small. Only one family could attempt. and they had issues with the flight and landed still in the east.
In the east, yeah.
Quite luckily for them, where they landed was actually a forest, where people weren't permitted to go.
Because also the materials needed to make a hot air balloon were restricted. So if they were found, the authorities would then largely be able to trace their origin, and so it would be, you had the potential to be caught.
Yeah, when they came to balloon number 3, and this would be the successful escape attempt, one of the escapers, Gunther Wenzel, actually has published his own website, which also translates to English, which is great. You can read it right out of the horse's or escaper's mouth.
Okay.
And he detailed what they had to do to get the fabric for the 3rd balloon, especially because eventually the Stasi had found the 2nd balloon. It's its wreckage in the forest. So the Stasi knows they're looking for homemade balloon makers.
Yes.
So they had to be that much more cautious with materials for balloon round 3. And they're driving all over East Germany to get some taffeta. And I don't know about you, but I associate taffeta with tutus. And you just ballet too? No, you haven't made your own tutus?
Is that tulle?
Oh, never mind.
Okay.
Carry on. So they're driving all over East Germany to buy taffeta. They're buying material that would normally be used for tents, umbrella silk.
So like canvas and stuff.
Yeah, a variety of materials, but they're only buying in small quantities to make sure it couldn't bring any attention. And they're driving to all different cities to buy this stuff because they ended up needing 1,300 square meters of material. And they had to buy it in small portions so it wouldn't alert attention.
Yeah, exactly.
So they were actually successful in 1979.
Yes. And they landed in Neile near Hof.
So it's worth saying this is not an escape over the Berlin Wall. You know, we said there are about 5,000 over the wall itself, many more over the inner east-west German border. This is an escape over the inner east-west German border. So they went from the state of Thüringen, and then they landed in Bavaria. Mm-hmm. And finally, they weren't really sure when they landed if they'd made it to the west because they very quickly got disoriented up high. And so when they landed, the women and children hid and the men went kind of exploring. And they ended up in a farmhouse. And when they saw the machinery in the farmhouse, they read the brand and they were pretty sure, we're in the west. That brand of tractor in East Germany is unlikely, but they're still not totally sure. Until the 2 men ran into the police. And it's the Bavarian police. And they say, are we in the West? And the Bavarian man says, where else would you be? And success. Yeah. But that's round 3 in terms of it took 3 balloons to successfully make it out. But they did.
Yeah, you can obviously then tell that they were pretty desperate to leave. And, you know, it does kind of impress upon you like how, you know, this regime, you know, it really does have to lock its population in, and the fact that people are still willing to attempt stuff like that, it shows, you know, how desperately people wanted to leave. Although I do want to say, in the interest of balance, I do still meet plenty of people who did like life in the GDR, so that's always something that needs to be made clear when you're talking about this stuff. It's not as black and white as we're taught in the West, that communism bad, capitalism good. You know, there was a grey area, you know, and a lot of people I meet from the former East actually miss life back in the GDR. So in the interest of balance, I do just want to make that
I'm
clear.
so glad you said that. Actually, when we said we'd do this episode on escapes together, I thought we have to say this at some point, that when you look at the escapes and people willing to risk life and limb and freedom to get out, it looks like appalling. Life in East Germany must have been so terrible. Yeah. And for some it was. If you fell on the wrong side of the regime, the darkness of that nation was really dark. Yeah. But for many, and let's not forget that it has a population of around 16 million, and there are 100,000 escape attempts. You have to keep this in verhältnis kind of in perspective. Many people in East Germany had a very good, simple, stable, everyday life experience. And a lot of those people who defend it, either because they actually miss it or just because they say, hey, it wasn't great, but it wasn't only bad.
That's what they say.
Something they always reference is things like guaranteed jobs and housing for life, free healthcare, free education, women in the workforce compared to in the West. A woman had to have her husband's permission to have a job, legalized homosexuality. So I think it's really good that you mentioned that, because I think we have a lot of friends. If you live in Berlin, about a third of my friends' parents grew up in East Germany. And often they don't appreciate this narrative that your life must have been so terrible. So it's good that we can live with ourselves. Our East German friends won't be mad at us for only painting a one-sided image.
Yeah. And that's what you've always got to be. When you talk about all kinds of history, really, you've got to be aware of the nuances, really, because a lot of history, not all history, I mean, the Holocaust, that's not particularly nuanced.
Yeah, that's...
but a lot of history is quite nuanced because it's, perspective and how, you experienced it. Now, when the wall was built, you basically had instances where you had basically the front door in the west, but most of the house was in the east and was considered to be in the east.
Yeah. So their street is the west.
Yes.
They enter and exit through the west, but actually their house is legally in the east.
In the east. And so obviously people had to, when they woke up on the morning of the 13th of August, they had to kind of make a sort of snap decision whether they were going to, stay in the east, or if they were going to, move out to the west, because they probably knew that it wasn't going to stay like that for much longer. So obviously if you lived on the ground floor, that was fine, because you could just, put your stuff out of the window and then just step out onto the west. But obviously if you lived in a higher floor, that might be a bit more problematic, because eventually the authorities got wind of this and they started breaking up the windows, and so people had to jump from higher and higher and higher. And this is actually how the first death at the Berlin Wall happened. Someone called Ida Siegmann, who 9 days after the wall was built, so on the 22nd of August, she was getting ready to jump out of her window down, and basically what would happen is the person who was going to jump, they would write a note on a piece of paper saying which window they were going to jump out of and at what time, and they throw it down into the west, and then the West Berliners would get the fire brigade to come and pull out a safety net for them. And you can see videos of this on YouTube, stock footage. And basically she was getting ready to jump, but the Stasi stormed her apartment before she was ready, before the fire brigade had basically had a chance to pull out the safety net. So she actually jumped to her death. So yeah, that was actually the first death at the Berlin Wall. And then very soon after, there was some ambiguity about this, but there was eventually a shoot to kill order given by the East German authorities to border guards. So basically anyone who tried to flee over the border was liable to be shot. And I think it was actually there since before, but it actually wasn't explicitly ordered, I think, until October 1961. However, you did have 11 days after the wall was built, the first person shot at the wall. So on the 24th of August, 1961, someone called Günther Litvin. Now, people like him were a major part of the reason why the GDR government wanted to seal this last hole in the Iron Curtain, because he lived in the East with its generous social subsidies, its cheap rent, its cheap food. But then he actually worked and got paid in the West, and I think he was a tailor.
Yeah, so Günther Litvin had already been working in West Berlin as a tailor, and he'd got an apartment in the West. It makes sense, right? You get housing where you have your work, and given the nature of his work, he was working near Bahnhof Zoo, if anyone knows it, in the west of Berlin. And he hadn't registered that address because, of course, had he have registered a West Berlin address, he's now outed himself as someone who's committed the crime of fleeing the Republic. So he's actually living in the West. Yeah, Republikflug was actually a crime of leaving. Flucht, not Flug.
Yeah.
And so he was actually living in West Berlin, but not registered there. And he'd spent a Sunday with his family in the East. And they wake up in the morning and hear on the radio that the border's sealed, and poor Günther Litvin is expected at a job on the other side of the wall, and he's paying rent in an apartment on the other side of the wall.
And so then 11 days later, on the 24th of August, he tried to swim the Teltow Canal, which is a bit of canal with one side being on the west, one side being on the east. Tried to swim to the west, but he was shot dead in the water. So he was the first person to get shot at the wall.
He was only 24 years old.
And only 24 years old, yes.
And of course, a lot of people in East Germany knew once the war was up that the regime would very quickly come for the border crossers, which is what they'd called those people who were working in the West while living in the East. So people like that, like Litvin, could expect It's uncertain what would have been done with them. Worst case scenario, they're jailed in East Germany. More likely, they'd have been given really unpleasant jobs, and
Yeah.
then their life opportunities forever will be limited.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the position that poor young man found himself in.
Yeah.
And I think for Litfin, like many East Germans, full stop, they just couldn't believe that guns would be used.
Yeah, and the thing is, a lot of West Berliners saw it happen, and they saw his body get taken out of the water. And obviously that was a bit of a PR disaster for East Germany. But actually, the worst PR disaster came a year later in August 1962. And this was probably the most famous death at the Berlin Wall. Someone called Peter Fechter, an 18-year-old bricklayer whose sister lived in West Berlin, and he had obviously been split off from her when the wall went up a year earlier, and he decided that he wanted to flee to the west. And his friend, someone called Helmut K, that he was doing his apprenticeship with, also wanted to escape. So on the 17th of August 1962, he and Helmut, they go along the wall at the Zimmerstrasse near Checkpoint Charlie, and they found an abandoned workshop that actually was backed onto the death strip, which was the strip of land between the inner and outer border walls in Berlin, where you weren't allowed to be, and if you were there, you were liable to be shot. So they snuck into the workshop, and they basically kept lookout out of the window to see, I guess, a good window to try and escape. And then they, at about 1:30 in the afternoon, they decided to seize their chance. They jumped out of the window into the death strip, ran out to the outer wall. I think they were actually seen pretty quickly by the border guards, who fired a warning shot to let them know that they'd seen them. Now, his friend Helmut ran to the wall and climbed up and over into the west with quite a bit of ease, with no difficulty really. But unfortunately, Fechter actually froze at the wall momentarily. And then when he tried to climb up and over to the west, he was then shot in the hip and fell back into the death strip. Now, the thing about that is that it happened in full view of a load of West Berliners on the other side. They saw the whole thing happen. And so they were obviously very distressed by it, and they tried to get the West Berlin police to intervene, but obviously there wasn't really a whole lot they could do because he was trapped in the death strip. I think they just threw over some bandages, and he was crying out for help. He was obviously bleeding out. And there was a Western photographer at the scene, someone called Wolfgang Behrer, and he ran to Checkpoint Charlie, very nearby, and said to the American soldiers, we have a young East German at the wall who's been shot. We need to try and get him into the west, otherwise he's going to bleed out. And reportedly, the American soldiers said, that's not our problem. And the West Berlin police obviously didn't want to get involved because they knew that they would have retaliations from the East German border guards, but also the East German border guards were then worried that they would have retaliation from the West. So you have this kind of classic, I guess, Cold War situation with this poor young man stuck in the middle. The photographer, Wolfgang Behrer, he goes back and then he gets a ladder, climbs up the ladder and sticks his little handheld camera through the wire and takes pictures of Fechter lying in the death strip because he decided that he wanted the whole world to see it. And so those images of Fechter bleeding out in the death strip were then splashed across Western newspapers the next day.
And this wasn't over quickly. This was, he spent quite some time
55
bleeding
minutes,
to death.
yeah.
And for a period, he's screaming. And this is in full public view. And then it's broadcast all over the world. This is the ultimate PR nightmare for socialist East Germany.
Exactly. And and also for the Western Allies, because eventually, it actually causes quite a lot of outrage in West Berlin, because obviously they heard about what the soldier at Checkpoint Charlie said, and this actually led to rioting in West Berlin, because West Berliners thought, if the Western Allies are not going to, try and protect the freedom of every German, then why are you here? Why are you still in West Berlin? Well, what good is you being here? So it actually caused a lot of anger.
It's tricky, of course, with Fechter being in the death strip. The death strip was legally still socialist East Germany. So for an American or any Western soldier or force to have gone in there, they're technically crossing the border.
So basically, yeah, he was left for 55 minutes bleeding out, and then eventually the East German border guards went to get him, took him away, and you can actually see pictures of him being carried away as well, and he died later on in hospital. And his family were put under surveillance. Obviously, they had a lot of, even though, you know, he had died and it was pretty tragic, they were actually then put under surveillance by the East German authorities.
That's something really incredible in all the escape stories, whether failed or successful, is that it's not over then. The Stasi keeps going.
Exactly.
So, for example, deaths at the Berlin Wall, or someone who's injured at the wall, and then the bodies weren't dealt with in the normal way. The issue of a body of someone who's been killed at the wall goes straight to the Stasi. So the East German secret police actually take over the details of their estate, their possessions. Also, for example, often deaths were hidden. The families were told fake stories. And even people who were successful. So, for example, the families who made it into West Germany through the hot air balloon, the Stasi put spies into their lives. And they actually had an operation, I think it was called Operation Pear, which was to make their lives in West Germany miserable. So that's the other incredible thing, is that even if after the escape, even if you lose a loved one in the escape, that's not over yet.
Yeah.
And for those East Germans left behind, either by loved ones who successfully escaped or tried to escape, they were therefore considered unreliable socialists by virtue of the fact that someone in their circle has escaped. So they're now under surveillance, and very likely their life opportunities were restricted in East Germany.
Exactly. And that's exactly the case of what happened in one of the most successful escapes that was also caught on camera. A very, very famous image of an East German border guard called Conrad Schumann. I'm sure probably most people have seen the image. I feel like it's probably one of the most iconic images from the Cold War. So basically, it was taken on the 15th of August 1961, so 2 days after the war went up. Now, Schumann he had just completed his training to become a border guard, because in the East you had to do 2 years of military service, much like you had to in the West as well. Actually, a lot of people don't know that. And he decided to work for the border service. So he then gets stationed at the Ruppiner Straße, Bernauer Straße kind of corner, which was on the Berlin Wall, so where the border was. And he was assigned to take control and protect the border from the enemies of socialism. Because also, let's remember, when the East German government built the wall, they called it the anti-fascist protection barrier, to keep capitalism and fascism out. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Schumann, remember, he was, only 19 years old, so pretty young. He and his unit found themselves pretty unprepared for the task, because I think they thought they were just going to oversee the building of the wall, but I think they weren't really prepared for what they were going to, the psychological and, kind of a mental anguish of people that was being suffered by people after being separated from friends and family. So throughout the morning, Schumann faced quite a lot of verbal abuse from people on the Western side. So people on the Western side, they could approach the West, no problem. They could go up to the wire. And at that point, it was just a roll of barbed wire whilst the main wall was being built. And so he was being hurled with insults by West Berliners. But it's actually when he saw the real effect of the Berlin Wall, so the division of communities and of families and friends, he saw a young woman approach from the East Berlin side and an older woman approach from the Western side. The younger woman on the Eastern side had some flowers, and she passed them over to the older woman and said, "Happy birthday, Mum." And she, got very visibly very upset, and she was pointing at Schumann, saying, it's because of him that we can't be together. And I think this really kind of makes him kind of rethink his loyalties. A crowd of West Berliners on the other side, they start sort of changing tactics. They can see that they've got a chink in his armor. And they start trying to persuade him to come over, saying, "Come on, come rüber, come over." And he actually, because obviously so many building materials were arriving, because it was when the actual wall was, because first of all, the way they did it was just with barbed wire, and then they built the actual wall. So he basically goes up to the barbed wire and flattens it with his boot. And he says to the West Berliners on the other side, "Stay away," but then whispers to them, "I'm going to jump." Okay. And so he does visibly get quite nervous, and you can actually see some of this on stock footage. So on the western side, they get the policeman, the West Berlin police, to bring up a van. They open the door ready for him, and someone starts filming him. And he's visibly very nervous. He's pacing back and forth. He's smoking loads of cigarettes. He's so obviously, waiting for the right moment. And then suddenly he flicks away a cigarette, turns, runs, jumps over the barbed wire, dropped his weapon, his gun, and lands in the west and jumps into the back of the police van. And West German photographer Peter Leibing captured the iconic moment, which is called the leap to freedom. Then taken away and, interrogated to make sure that he is not working for the Stasi. And then he eventually resettles in Bavaria. And he had various jobs, including working at an Audi factory. Now, you might think, oh, yay, that sounds like a really nice story, a really kind of inspirational story. But and unfortunately, it didn't have a happy end. And it's partly because of what we were just talking about. Basically, he never really felt safe in the West. Because of what Miss Ernestina said, you could always have reprisals. He always had this kind of hanging over him. And, because it was well known that you could be, kidnapped and taken back to the GDR, or, that you could have these kinds of reprisals. And he said he never felt actually safe again until the wall fell. But then even after the wall fell in 1989, he then went back to Saxony to see his family, and they rejected him. And the reason is obviously because, they were put under surveillance by the Stasi. They would have had all kinds of opportunities and stuff taken away from them. So it had, an actual tangible effect on their family's life. And so basically him escaping ruined his family's life. And so they were very cold to him. And so then after that, he fell into a deep depression, turned to alcoholism, and then he committed suicide in 1998 by hanging himself from an apple tree.
This is such a sad story. Quite often on tours to Bernaustraße in Berlin, the Berlin Wall Memorial, I show people this photo. It's huge on the wall in the corner. And everyone says, oh, the leap to freedom, and everyone's smiling and they're taking photos of it. And then I ruin their days by telling them the whole story. But I think it's such a powerful story to show that this is complex.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that it's really complex, that it's not just these incredible stories of hot air balloons and tunnels and the guy who made his own homemade submarine and did make it to Denmark.
Yeah,
It's also this complexity of the layers that come with leaving an oppressive state. Who do you leave behind? Do they follow you into the new state? I think Conrad Schumann's leap to freedom and the suicide that came 40 years after it, I think is the ultimate example of how complex this really is.
Exactly, yeah. So talking about other successful escapes, what have you got for us, Miss Ernestina?
So this is one of my favorites. This is a real crowd pleaser on tours. This is the story of a young man named Wolfgang Engels. And one of the reasons I love using this story on tours is because it really shows that element we were talking about earlier about the level of surveillance close to the wall in East Germany.
Yeah.
So Wolfgang Engels, as a young man, had spent much of his life in Dusseldorf, but then he was living in the East. And he wasn't really that disenchanted with it, from my understanding, although he was one of the young men deployed to build the wall. And as he was building it, he certainly had moments where he thought, I might never see those friends in Dusseldorf ever again.
That's interesting. I didn't realize he was originally from the West.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah. The moment for him, which was a real break with East Germany, was that he and some mates had a night out in East Berlin, stumbled out of a bar, really unknowingly stumbled too close to the eastern side of the wall, and suddenly they're being treated like criminals. That their own police is checking their papers and interrogating them and searching their bodies and treating them like criminals because they wandered too close to the eastern side of the wall, and it was a true accident. And he was so disenchanted with this, so really disgusted by this, that it fermented the idea of getting out.
Mm-hmm.
So this is April 17th, 1963. So the Berlin Wall's about 1.5 years old. Wolfgang is 19 years old. And he's working as a car mechanic and as a civilian driver for the National People's Army. And the National People's Army connection will be his way out. He gets wind that the new tanks are coming into East Germany, which I think were actually just Soviet hand-me-down tanks at this time. And he buddies up to the guys in the new tank battalion and just pretends to be super fascinated by vehicles and everything on wheels, and asks all of these questions about the tanks, with the kind of cover story being that he's just super tank fascinated, but actually he's gathering the information that you would need to steal one. So he steals the tank with the information that he gathered from the boys, and he drives it through Berlin, and he literally bulldozes it through the Berlin Wall.
And also, before he did that, he stopped and he said to a crowd of people, "I'm going to the West. Anyone want to join me?" I just think that that's probably not a very clever thing to do.
It's not stealth.
No.
It's not stealth.
Yes, exactly. And no one did go with him. Everyone kind of looked at him like, wait, what? And so, yeah, he just carried on by himself. So, yeah, smashed on through the wall.
He's incredibly lucky he lived. So this is April 1963, right? Again, the wall's only 1.5 years old. Had he have tried this in the early 70s, you're looking at that structure you guys talked about in your podcast last week about 2 walls, death strip in the middle. Even a tank's not going through that. Actually, because of Wolfgang Engels, they built anti-tank barriers into the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
And I always think, imagine telling your grandkids, you know the anti-tank barriers in the Berlin Wall? Yeah, that's for me.
Yeah,
they did that because of me.
Yeah,
You'd be like, sure,
your
Granddad.
claim to fame. Yeah.
So basically, when he bulldozes the tank through, the tank gets trapped in the wall itself. He manages to get onto the bonnet of the tank, and shots start coming from behind. And he actually gets shot through the lung in this process. And in an interview, he said that at one point when he's on the bonnet of this tank, he's thinking, if I live, today was a good day.
Yeah.
If I get out of this alive, that's been a success. And he was lucky because technically the bullets of East German border guards were not to penetrate into West Berlin. Right? That's literally East German guards, a brother nation of the Soviet Union, is now shooting into the West, which is occupied by America. This kind of thing is exactly what could have made that Cold War go hot.
Yes.
So it wasn't allowed. And as soon as an East German bullet entered West Berlin forces had permission to shoot back. So lucky for Wolfgang Engels, when he bulldozed through the tank, there were
Through the wall.
No, sorry, thank you, through the wall. When he bulldozed the tank through the wall, there were West Berlin police at that location. And when the East German border guards, their bullets chasing Engels, start entering West Berlin, the West Berlin police could shoot back, and that gave him the cover to make it off the bonnet of the tank through the barbed wire and into West Berlin, where I believe he stumbled into a bar.
Oh, really?
I believe he stumbled into a bar.
Okay, right. Sounds like he likes bars. But yeah, no, that obviously shows that was a very, that could have turned pretty nasty, having an exchange of fire between these border guards. That could have, spiraled out of control. He was rushed to a hospital in West Berlin, and he underwent surgery for his wounds, but he made a full recovery. And yeah, he became a teacher of biology and history in the town of Zoltau. But again, this was after effect of him escaping. Yeah, he lost touch with his mother in the East, and she actually viewed him as a traitor and didn't want anything more to do with him. Now, one of the most daring escapes took place from a famous building in the government district called, well, back then it was the House of Ministries. It's this huge Nazi building which was originally built to house the Ministry of Aviation, so it was the headquarters of the Luftwaffe. There's very typical sort of Nazi architecture. And if you go there, you can tell it does impress upon you this kind of, idea of Nazi grand kind of architecture.
Monumental, intimidating. Yeah.
Exactly.
Very appropriately today houses the tax office.
Yes,
it's the perfect thing to put in a Nazi building.
Exactly. Really. Yeah. And I always say that it just went from one evil to another. That always elicits a few laughs.
This building is tour guide joke. It makes our lives very easy, that building, really.
Yeah, so, but basically during the GDR, it was used as the House of Ministries. So you had various ministries housed in there. And you had a guy from Leipzig, I believe. From Leipzig? Yeah, he didn't live in Berlin, but he basically came to Berlin twice a month as part of his work. And because he worked for the Communist Party, and he had to, and part of his work involved coming to Berlin every so often. So he wanted to escape to the West. This is in 1965, and however, he has a 9-year-old son and a wife who he doesn't want to leave behind. So he actually starts planning the escape 2 years before, so in 1963, and he basically decided to use his bi-monthly trips to Berlin to bring his family there and to try and escape over the wall. because basically the way the wall was built, the House of Ministries actually jutted out onto the death strip. And so the roof, it would be very easy to get over to the west. The distance from the east to the west was not that big.
This is abnormal in anywhere in the Berlin Wall to have a building this close to the wall.
Yeah.
Normally, anything that close to the wall is bulldozed, knocked down, so they've got that big clear death strip that you guys talked about last week. They've made an exception for this building partly because it's so well built, right? It survived the Second World War, and because it's being used by the government, by the Socialist Unity Party, and of course no reliable socialists would ever want to, members of the government would never want to escape. So this building's an exception. There's nowhere else in East Berlin where you're in the death strip that close to the wall to the west.
Yeah. And so, basically brings his family in and basically hides them in a bathroom on the top floor while he's there for his meetings and what have you. And he, at the end of the day, when everyone has gone home, he then goes to get them and brings them out onto the roof, so up over the death strip. And he has various escape tools. He has carrying straps, a handmade rope pulley, padded socks, and a hammer wrapped in foam rubber. So basically, this is at 9:45 p.m. They climbed up onto the roof and they threw a hammer attached to a nylon rope over the wall to family members that were waiting in the west for him. And the family members waiting for him on the other side connected the nylon rope to a 120-meter steel cable. And basically, they then pulled the steel cable onto the roof and attached it to a flagpole. The flagpole's not there anymore, but there was a flagpole on a corner of the roof there. And the helpers in West Berlin, on the other side of the wall, then stretched the cable with a truck. And then the family basically just zip-wired over the death strip, okay, from east to west. And the thing about this escape is that it happened in full view of a border guard who was watching the whole thing happen through binoculars. And I believe that they interrogated him, and the reason that he said he didn't say anything is because he said he thought it was the Stasi doing a covert operation to get their operatives into the West, which is either really good thinking on his feet or stupidity.
I think for me, the way I always interpreted that soldier's failure to shoot or failure to arrest, he's watching this whole thing happen. And this wasn't quick because they sent their son and the wife first, and Heinz himself went last. But they had issues whereby the angle wasn't what they needed it to be. And so Heinz was actually having to manually hold up the cable so that his son and his wife could get over. And then Heinz himself is sitting on that roof for quite some time, I think maybe nearly an hour.
Oh, really?
Yeah, trying to figure out what's the plan until he comes up with a solution for how he can adjust the angle so he can zip line over the wall like the two before him. And so the guard has, the Soviet soldier who's watching this, I don't know why it wasn't an Eastern border guard, it was a Soviet soldier.
Oh, it was a Soviet soldier, yeah.
And he had time to think about this.
Yeah.
And so I've always interpreted his failure to shoot or to alert to anyone else as just how bold this was.
Yeah.
This is a zip line escape off an East German government building.
Yeah.
I really think he probably just looked at that and thought, it's got to be our boys. You know, there's no way this can actually be a spontaneous escape.
So you think he did genuinely think that?
I think so. I mean, who knows? I'd love to ask him.
Yeah,
but this is quite a bold escape. I mean,
if you're out there listening to this, get in touch with us. We would love to hear what you were genuinely thinking at the time when you saw this family escaping to the West.
Yeah, please write us on the History Buff or Tina's Tours Berlin and be like, it's me.
Yeah, we're waiting for you. So yeah, that was obviously a pretty daring escape. And yeah, they made it across and they settled in Munich. And so yeah, they were one of 5,000 people who fled East Germany between 1961 and 1989.
If you just Google zipline escape over the Berlin Wall, you can actually find newspaper articles that had the family in it, and you see the apparatus which they put their son in so that he could zipline over. It's like basically overalls. They basically put this adorable little boy in overalls, connected the overalls to the wire so they could push him off the roof.
Yeah.
And that sense of going public once they were in the West was really quite clever because it helps to be somewhat of a protective factor.
Yes, exactly.
If the Stasi are going to try and kidnap you out of West Berlin and bring you back to East Germany, put you in jail, if you've become overnight celebrities in the Western world, that really ceases to be an option.
Yes, exactly.
They can still spy on you. They can put operatives into your life to make it very difficult, but they can't really kidnap you and take you back to East Germany and put you in jail.
No, exactly. Yeah, they were covering their tracks. Cool. Okay. Well, I think we should finish with what is probably my favorite escape. Escapes. Okay. It actually involves the separate escapes of three brothers. Okay. They were the Bethke brothers. Okay. And you had three of them. Okay. You had Ingo, Holger, and Egbert.
These are great German names.
Yes, I know, right?
After Wolfgang Engels, we're really on fire with the German names in this podcast.
Ingo Bethke. So Ingo was 7 when the wall was erected, and he actually served in the National People's Army, so actually guarding the border. On the 26th of May, 1975, he and a friend, so Ingo and a friend, cut through the border fence, and they dodged detection measures, and actually then managed to cross the Elbe on an air mattress, which is...
Let's also say this is not normal that someone could cut through and dodge all the reason he was able to do all of that is because he'd served his time in the National People's Army, his compulsory military service at the border there. Because his parents were party faithfuls. Both mum and dad were members of the Socialist Unity Party working for the Innenministerium.
Ministry of the Interior.
Thank you, the Ministry of the Interior. Innenministry. Ministry of the Interior, that would be in English. And I think his dad was a major, mum was a lieutenant colonel. So partly because he's got such a good socialist record, he was allowed to serve right on the border. And he used his time at the border to study it. He memorized every stone, every link in the chain, and that's how he was able to stage this escape. Otherwise, just making it through the border fortifications.
Yeah. Well, and so he manages to get over.
On a blow-up mattress. Let's say that again because it's excellent.
Exactly, yeah. On a blow-up mattress. So that's 1 out of 3. So then you have Holger. And so Ingo actually kept in contact with his family after the escape, I think through coded messages and all of this.
Yeah, people often ask you, could you still have communication? Yeah, there were letters. Normal homes in East Germany didn't have telephones, but there were public telephones. Communications were possible, but of course...
You would know that it would be...
tapped and watched, especially if you're someone who escaped out of East Germany into West Germany. Any communications that you have with your family back home are being monitored by the Stasi.
No, exactly. So he kept in contact using kind of secretive means. So his time comes in 1983. So on the 31st of March, Holger escaped also using a zip wire. So zip wires were actually, I think, quite a popular way of escaping. It's because I think just the height, the fact that it's above, and obviously a lot of the border guards probably just didn't think to look above, and so I think a lot of people, and also because the distance that you have, the distance of the death strip in Berlin was not actually that long. In certain areas, that did change. But in certain areas, it really wasn't that long.
I think it also really cleverly shows how well fortified this thing was. You know, they've shut down all the sewage systems. They've got spies in every potential escape network, which largely shut down tunneling. And what didn't shut down the tunneling through spying, the Stasi actually built a tunnel running almost the Stasi tunnel. The tunnel to dissect all other tunnels.
Yeah, that goes diagonally across the underneath the death strip. To intercept other tunnels. Yeah.
And then, of course, the death strip itself makes it almost effectively possible to escape on ground level. And so this thing is so well fortified that at a certain point, going above ground, overhead, is one of the only options available to you.
Exactly, because also by 1965, people stopped building tunnels because the Stasi had built tunnels to intercept other ones. The death strip was too wide, and also again it was just too dangerous. Lots of tunnels collapsed, and it just wasn't safe enough. So that's why then eventually mostly people went over. So, Holger actually practiced archery. He scouted the wall and fired an arrow connected to a cable over the wall. So that's how he managed to get the cable over the wall. And so he and a friend, they actually basically had to wait in a house at the border for 13 hours to find the perfect time to shoot the arrow. And they had 3 arrows. So the first 2 failed, Okay, didn't actually get over the wall or like to where they needed to shoot the arrow. So they had one chance left. Okay, and but this one they managed to get it over to the west and into basically the place where they needed to get it. They had obviously someone waiting for them on the western side who pulled it taut. However, when they ziplined over, the way that it was, the dip was too... It wasn't big enough, so they actually got stuck halfway, and so they actually then had to crawl on the wire over to the west. So, but it was still successful. So, 2 out of 3. So, the only one left in the east is Egbert. I don't know what I would think if my brothers kept abandoning me. I kind of feel a bit hard done by, I think, if I was Egbert. But anyway, so he was left in the east. So, the others, so Ingo and Holger, decided to get him out themselves.
So I think let's jump to the end of that story because it's so good, and then we'll work backwards. So then we come to 1989, which actually is the year that the Berlin Wall will fall.
Obviously they did know that was
no
gonna
one
happen.
can know that, right? Even when people woke up that morning, no one's thinking the Berlin Wall's falling today. That was quite the surprise. So certainly in, I think it was May when they staged the escape.
26th of May.
Certainly no one can know that the wall is falling this year. And May 1989, there are 2 light aeroplanes parked in front of the Reichstag, Germany's parliamentary building, just on the big field in front of Parliament. Well, I mean, it wasn't Parliament at the time. It wasn't used as Parliament by West Berlin. But in the front of the Reichstag building, there are 2 light aircraft. And basically, who's been flying them? The Bethke brothers. And where have they gone? They've gone to drink a beer. Yeah. So let's track that story back as to how the 2 first brothers who escaped, Ingo and Holger...
Holger, and Egbert.
Yeah, how Ingo and Holger will get Egbert out. So basically, they got the idea from the Playboy helicopter, which actually for me is kind of disappointing. I'm like, can we not have Playboy as an inspiring element of this escape? But we do. There's the truth. History's not always elegant.
Yeah.
So basically, they got the idea of a flight to get out Egbert from the Playboy helicopter. They had to sell their pub to have the money, basically to buy 2 light aircraft.
Yeah, microlights, they're called, microlights.
They got a bit of a discount on the sale because they openly told the West German aircraft seller what they were going to do with the planes.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So they buy these 2 light aircraft. They learn how to fly. Mm-hmm. And they find someone who's willing to get the planes from West Germany in a truck along the highway access routes into West Berlin, which wasn't an easy feat because recreational
you have to
flying...
go through East Germany as well.
Mm-hmm. And recreational flying is forbidden in West Berlin, but they find a truck driver who's willing to play along. They get the planes into West Berlin. They'd had someone smuggle over a walkie-talkie to Egbert and give him code words, and the code would be Ulrike is healthy. So when Egbert gets a call, Ulrike is healthy, he will go to the agreed location in Treptow Park.
Yeah.
And the whole thing takes about 15 minutes, right? Because, I mean, it's a big city, but it's still just a city. They're flying from the west of Berlin into the east of Berlin. Egbert is hiding in the bushes with the walkie-talkie. They let him know when they're coming. So actually, Holger is
stays circling overhead,
ahead,
keeping a lookout.
Yeah. And Ingo is the one.
lands in Treptow Park, and obviously, Egbert is waiting behind a tree and jumps in, and they take off again. They did actually try to do it a couple of weeks before on the 11th of May, but the weather wouldn't allow them. The weather was really bad, so they actually then had to put it off. And also something clever they did, they painted Soviet symbols on the sides of the light aircraft. So it would just make them look like they were Soviet aircraft doing exercises.
And very clever. Ingo, having done his military service, he said there is no way East German soldiers will shoot at something with a Soviet star in it.
Yes.
No way.
Exactly.
That was very clever.
Yeah, very clever. So Egbert is waiting for them, gets out from the bush, gets into the aircraft. They take off again. They fly back over the wall. And they land back at the Reichstag in the park in Tiergarten in West Berlin. And it was all over in 16 minutes. Crazy, really. And the thing about that escape is that they actually filmed it all on home video, and you can watch it on YouTube. Really,
Very
really
clever.
cool. Really, really cool.
They came under quite a bit of fire for that. This was quite a topic at the time the Berlin Wall was the taking of money to help someone escape. And for some people, they said, well, it's expensive. These young men had sold their pub, they'd bought aircraft. I think one of them paid for flying lessons and then quit as soon as they could get the plane off the ground or something.
Right.
There are a lot of costs associated, especially tunneling. That's very expensive.
Yeah.
And of course, you risk your life and your freedom. But some people really did try and make a business out of this. The prices became sometimes ridiculous. And so there was a lot of moral and ethical discussion about those who took money to help someone escape. And the Bethke brothers were also, from some people, under fire from the fact that they sold the footage of their brother's escape. But of course, again, they've had to sell their pub and buy 2 aircrafts and learn to fly. And the perk for us is that there's incredible footage of this escape. You can see it in real time.
It is
of
amazing.
The 2 brothers helping the 3rd escape out of East Berlin by plane. And they're obviously aware of the drama that they've parked in front of the Reichstag and then wandered off for beers.
Yeah.
Which one of them in interviews described as freedom beers.
Oh no, but it's a great story, and yeah, watching it. I mean, watching them fly through the air on the footage that you can see on YouTube. It sort of, it all happens so quietly and so calmly. It doesn't kind of, it definitely belies the kind of enormity of what they're doing. Although one should remember, actually, by that point, the order shoot to kill had actually been rescinded. It was rescinded in April 1989.
I did also want to say something about the Schießbefehl, or the order to shoot. And it's interesting, we use that word, Schießbefehl. The word Befehl is literally command.
Yeah.
But after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when politicians and border guards were sometimes being put on trial for shots and deaths at the wall, a lot of the political leaders and the part of the legal apparatus of East Germany hid behind the, I would say, technicality that it apparently wasn't actually an order to shoot, but a permission to shoot. But that is, from most accounts, not how it was communicated to the young men who were working on the border. It's communicated to them that you need to stop escapes.
Yeah.
And if you can't stop it through a method other than shooting, then you can shoot, and you have to stop that escape.
And actually, also, border guards got commended for, and they got like awards and incentives for shooting people trying to escape.
Yeah, there are medals, there are financial incentives if you have shot an escapee at the wall. And I actually found an article, and again, I try and only use state reliable sources. I found an article that said that not a single case of shooting at the wall was, at the time by East Germany, actually examined for whether the shots were necessary.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so this kind of cop-out, I would say, that many in East Germany used after the fall of the wall, saying, oh, well, it wasn't an order to shoot, it was permission to shoot. That is certainly not how it's communicated to young men at the border. I actually even found some interviews by former East German border guards who said that before they would go out to work at the border, they were told that border violators must be apprehended or vernichtet.
Yeah.
And if you translate the word vernichtet, it's destroyed.
Yeah.
And then after the fall of the wall, to say, oh, well, it wasn't a Schießbefehl, it wasn't a command to shoot, it was a permission to shoot, is really unfair against the young men who were deployed on that border.
Yeah, because it puts it more on them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're out of time now, but I think, yeah, we can wrap up just by sort of saying that, yeah, it's obviously a very dramatic story, very tragic story of, deaths at the Berlin Wall. Obviously, you do have some amazing stories. Obviously, the Bethke brothers, Heinz Holzapfel, ziplining above the death strip. So you have all of these stories, some tragic, some, happy, and I guess some sort of in between. But what's constant is just how fascinating it is that this city was divided. This city was divided in two for 28 years. And you see, I think, just something very human, really, which is, people's desire for freedom, people's desire to see loved ones, and that's, I think, really the story that comes out from, the escape attempts and all of that kind of stuff that we've been talking about. What about you?
Yeah, so to recap, The wall stands for 28 years, and from the time they complete a first generation of wall, there are about 5,000 successful escapes. And that's just talking Berlin. There are some really spectacular Hollywood material escapes, like the homemade hot air balloon, zipline attempts, the Bethke brothers, where all three in a family get out, aeroplane, cable, ziplining, paddling across the Elbe River on a blow-up mattress. There's some really spectacularly cool, fascinating stuff that happens there, really brave and inspiring. But behind that, there are also 140 deaths at the wall. There are people like Gunter Littfen, who at the age of 24 have their light gone out by a shot.
Peter Fechter at the age of 18.
Bleeding to death, not quickly, in full public view, showing the real inhumanity of which the wall and that regime was capable. Ida Siegmann at 58, who falls to her death from her own balcony window because from one day to the next, she's not allowed out of her house door, and her sister lives 3 blocks away out of her house door. So behind these incredible stories of the escapes, there's also this incredible sadness of what happens when you slice through a living city and the people in it with the knife that is a border.
Exactly.
Dividing a population of people. Yeah.
Very nicely put. Guys, that's all we have time for today. But Miss Ernestina, thank you so much.
Thank you,
It's been wonderful
Artie.
talking to you.
So much fun.
Yeah, loved all your insights, all your information, your passion. That's what we love here at the History Buff.
Thank you.
So I can tell that you are a history buff. Yeah, well, guys, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. And please join us next week when we talk about life on either side of the walls and how Berlin actually became a bastion of counterculture. Cool. Okay, guys. Well, thank you very much. And yeah, see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.